Welcome to the Software Engineering Institute's 8th Annual Insider Risk Management Symposium, coming to you live from the campus of Carnegie Mellon University. My name is Randy Trezak, Principal Researcher and Technical Director in the CERT Division. It's my privilege to be the moderator for day one of this two-day event and a speaker on day two, which occurs tomorrow, Wednesday, September 29th from 11 a.m. to 1 p.m. Eastern Daylight Time. As you are likely aware, September is National Insider Threat Awareness Month, which is a collaborative effort between the National Counterintelligence and Security Center, the National Insider Threat Task Force, the Office of Undersecretary of Defense Intelligence and Security, the Department of Homeland Security, and the Defense Counterintelligence and Security Agency. The purpose of this month is to educate government and industry about the risk posed by insider threats and the role of insider threat programs. National Insider Threat Awareness Month 2021 seeks to encourage employees in government and private sector to recognize behaviors of concern and report them so early intervention can occur, leading to positive outcomes for at-risk individuals, as well as reduce the risk to organizations. Keeping with this theme, the SEI developed content for our two-day event to highlight the research completed to assist in insider risk reduction. I want to begin by recognizing the hard work completed by several folks to make this event happen. Thank you to Dan Costa, Technical Manager of CERT's Enterprise Threat and Vulnerability Management Team, members of the SEI's event staff, broadcast media, and business development teams for pulling this all together. I also want to send a thank you out to our three event sponsors, Code 42, Sidress, as well as ForcePoint. Throughout the event, you will have the opportunity to hear about each of these organizations and their contributions towards insider threat mitigation. I also want to take the opportunity to thank our keynote speaker, panelists, as well as panel moderators for volunteering their time, creating an amazing agenda, one that will provide actionable steps you can immediately integrate into your enterprise risk management programs. We hope you are able to attend both days of the symposium. Before we begin, I want to cover a few logistics for the event. This event is intended for invited guests only. There'll be no media in attendance, and we ask that you follow the Chatham House rules, not attributing any content to specific organizations unless express approval is granted by a speaker. And finally, if you do have questions, we encourage you to submit them through the chat feature in YouTube. Your questions will be addressed to the speakers or moderators and be addressed during the live Q&A session following each keynote or panel discussion. And at the end of the symposium, we hope you'll take time to complete the survey, providing feedback on content, the speakers, as well as influence future agendas for these events. Now, it's my privilege to introduce our keynote speaker for the event, General Greg Tuhill, Director of the CERT Division of the Software Engineering Institute. Prior to accepting the role in CERT, Greg was president of Appgate Federal, a provider of products and services to civilian government and defense agencies. In his government career, he was appointed by former President Obama to be the first Chief Information Security Officer of the United States government. He also served in the Department of Homeland Security as Deputy Assistant Secretary to the Office of Cybersecurity and Communications, where he concurrently served as the Director of the National Cybersecurity and Integration Center. I also want to recognize his military career, which spanned over 30 years in the United States Air Force as an operational commander at the squadron, group, and wing levels. Greg, thank you so much for your participation in this event, and I now turn it over to you for your opening remarks.
Thanks very much, Randy, and welcome to one and all. A hearty good day to you, and thank you for joining us today and hopefully tomorrow for this really important discussion on insider risk. And we're going to talk during the course of the next 2 days about some of the great research that's being done here at Carnegie Mellon, but in other places as well, and identifying some of the best practices in buying down our insider risk. Now, as we take a look at insider risk and the discussions over the course of the next 2 days, and hopefully well beyond, I'd like to point out, based on my personal observations and the research that I've done, that I'm very concerned that we at times get target fixation on the malicious threats that are out there. Those that are associated with activities that are frequently attributed to spies, saboteurs, nation-state actors, and criminal groups. And while these pernicious threats that could be manifest on the inside, and we should be making sure that we remain vigilant, let's not forget too the other insider risks that are out there that I believe are more prevalent, those that are associated with careless, negligent, indifferent, or sometimes confounded employees. And let me share my thoughts on those careless, negligent, indifferent, and confounded. Very often we have systems and organizations that run out of tolerance. And that's usually a great example of something that you can take a look at to see what kind of insider risk you have. Careless employees, folks who aren't doing the right things the right way, are an insider risk. Indifferent employees, folks who don't necessarily know or care about the policies, practices, best practices, those are an insider risk. The negligence out there where folks either through willful misconduct or just some other activity are negligent in making sure that things are properly patched and configured. That's an insider risk. And then let's talk confounded employees, folks, as well. Because as we take a look at our systems of systems, they're increasingly complex. And complexity often leads to confusion. And confounded employees often missteps, misconfigure, don't properly install, opening seams that adversaries, both on the inside and the outside, can exploit. As we take a look during the next couple of days at some of those best practices that are out there, we're going to explore all of the different threats that are out there, as well as share some of the best practices that our team and its research has produced. I'm looking forward to participating in the conference with you, and I'm looking forward to addressing any questions that you all have during the time that I can be with you during today's sessions. And with that, we look forward to your participation in the chat function, as Randy mentioned, and help us do better in our future research, as well as sharing best practices with our community. We've got over 600 participants today. Looking forward to the conversation and a very interactive session. Thank you for joining us in this important conference, and thank you for your participation. Randy, back to you. Let's get this show on the road.
Sounds great. Thank you, Greg. I do appreciate your participation as it demonstrates significant leadership in the area of insider threat risk mitigation. So it's my privilege to introduce our first session for today. The session is entitled, What's New from the Software Engineering Institute in Insider Risk? This particular session will be moderated by Mr. Matt Lukovic, the Technical Director of Cyber Risk and Resilience in the CERT Division of the Software Engineering Institute. Also, our panelists will be Mr. Dan Costa, as well as Carrie Gardner. So Matt, turn it over to you. Thank you very much for your participation as well.
Thank you, Randy. Thanks for the introductions. Good morning, Dan. Good morning, Carrie.
Morning, Matt. Good to be with you this morning.
Well, I'm really excited to explore what's new in insider risk. And let me first start with a question. There's been a subtle change in terminology. So I was hoping, Dan and Carrie, you might be able to explain to us the shift represented by describing the challenge as insider risk rather than exclusively insider threat.
Yeah, I'm happy to start that conversation. And Carrie, please feel free to build or fill gaps. After 2 decades of collecting and analyzing insider incident data to gain an understanding of what vulnerabilities existed within organizations that enabled insiders to carry out their attacks, one of the earliest findings we had was, hey, this is not necessarily just a technology problem, but a people problem that requires a holistic set of socio-technical controls that are designed to most effectively prevent, detect, and respond to insider threats. So we spent decades helping organizations with the controls designed to satisfy those categories. We started realizing were additional opportunities to address the concerning behaviors and activities that precede the harmful acts that malicious and unintentional insiders carry out against our organizations. So when we start talking about proactive ways to address the things that precede harmful acts within organizations, we're talking about now taking some probabilistic approach to identifying the impact and likelihood of not addressing those concerning behaviors and activity and letting them progress to the point where some loss activity happens within organizations. Along the way, we realized these are the principles of risk management, right? They're foundational components to risk management. So we've been doing this and thinking about this and characterizing this activity as kind of insider risk management for quite some time. The reason over the last couple of years for the pronounced shift with regards to kind of which portion of this we push forward is the risk management piece is the overarching activity that allows for proactive insider threat programs to most effectively and efficiently align, integrate, and collaborate, to be quite frank, with the way the rest of the enterprise deals with security and helps the organization manage all different types of risk. So this is something that if you look at our common sense guide to mitigating insider threats all the way back to the second or third edition, we've been talking about how to incorporate insider threats into risk management. But as formal insider threat programs have evolved over the past decade or so, we've really seen those programs bolstered by adopting an enterprise risk management approach to identifying their mission, selecting their controls, and quantifying the impact and likelihood of insider misuse.
Yeah, and building on that just a little bit, this is a multidisciplinary problem. As Ian was mentioning, this spans the behavioral sciences, the technical sciences, as well as management science. This comes to heart for me because I am in an MBA right now, and I'm taking some lessons learned on investment analysis, on economics, and thinking about how we can apply operations management and those types of considerations to this work. And because risk management is that overarching activity and kind of evaluating an organization's operations and risk across a variety of forms, cybersecurity and insider threat risk in particular is something where we can kind of build capacities and utilize those activities happening across an organization. So we do feel that risk management does serve as a language, as a way to build on those capabilities and kind of pivot to, also thinking about this as a risk resilience activity as well. Because in an event, insider incident were to occur, we want to make sure that organizations are prepared to maintain and sustain operations at a minimal level. So, we're able to take this language and our new way of thinking and kind of align that with the overarching risk management, risk resilience posture and lessons learned.
Thanks, Carrie. Thanks, Dan. I really like the description of how this is an interdisciplinary challenge. And you're drawing on not just technology, but also people and process. And so just to be clear, this is not de-emphasizing the insider threat or the risk represented by insiders, but rather, I think, putting it in a more comprehensive context. And that leads to my next question, which is when it comes to building insider threat or insider risk programs, how should organizations view this specific and specialized capability in relation to the other things that they do to identify, quantify, and manage risk?
Yeah, so in a class that's happening right now across the hall, we're teaching insider threat program managers how to build, scope, and operate their programs. And what's really important for insider risk management, insider threat program building in particular, is gaining an understanding and an accurate accounting of what's already in place within your organization. A lot of what insider threat programs have to do is be that sweet spot, that connective tissue between enterprise risk management functions, human resources functions, people management functions, information security, that coordinating component that enables information to flow across those traditionally stovepiped parts of organizations in a more effective, efficient, and risk-based manner. So much of what the insider threat program does is really amplifies existing capabilities and then augments those where needed. So step 0 is figure out what the scope of the program will be. And that needs to be informed by what capabilities are already in place that will form the components for an integrated capability that will allow us to connect the socio and technical approaches to managing insider risk. So you have to start by taking an account what's in place. From there, start taking a look at filling the gaps as needed and finding the right governance structure that fits within the organization. We get questions all the time about what to call it, where to put it, what its authorities need to be. Right? The right answer for a specific organization is a function that is purely dependent on what already is or is in place.
Thanks, Dan. Carrie, other thoughts about the fit for insider risk in the overall capabilities that organization needs to deploy to do cybersecurity in a sound manner?
Yeah, I would take it as a resource allocation problem where we have existing capabilities, perhaps some technical solutions. A security operations center has generally some type of SIM, which is collecting and aggregating these events, across the network. And that's a type of solution that can be leveraged or, dual hatted almost, with the security operations center as well as the insider threat hub. I say insider threat hub, but really that's, the data center of your insider risk management program. So there's many different, both technical and people and behavioral capabilities in an organization that can be leveraged. And those are just resources that the insider risk management program can draw upon. And by also framing this again as a risk management problem, we can think about measures. How can we measure the performance and the efficiency of taking advantage of existing resources? How can we think about our return on investment if we want to acquire or perhaps build or buy a different solution dedicated to insider risk? So I think this kind of gives us the platform to build these measures and to be able to perhaps tailor the appropriate right mitigator or solution if there is a gap or need that isn't met by other existing tooling or resources.
Thanks, Carrie.
Resource allocation is a big one, Carrie. And it's one of the kind of themes of some of the work that the team has been doing over the last year with regards to helping organizations better understand telemetry that is vital for the operation of an insider risk quantification capability. And what we see across kind of the tech landscape in 2021 is there are lots of different sensors that can provide us that telemetry to make those measurements. We were fortunate enough to partner with Microsoft through our Scilab campus collaborators to put to the test some of the Microsoft telemetry that's available that can potentially be dual purposed, as Carrie mentioned, to serve insider risk management or insider threat use cases. And one of the things that we were able to do over this study was map the availability of that telemetry to what our potential risk indicator framework derived from our empirical analysis of incident data says are the most commonly occurring conditions in different types of insider threat. So we took that mapping and then we said, great, what subset of this do we already have detectors for that within the Microsoft solutions that are on many of the networks and systems that organizations already have available to them, right? Let's not buy another thing if we don't necessarily have to. So what we were able to do then is make a contribution back to the open source community that said, okay, using this Windows telemetry, these are ways that you can deploy detectors through the Microsoft threat hunting capability that will allow you to detect use cases like data exfiltration to a competitor organization, exfiltration of data by an individual who is leaving or left the organization, the use of tools like steganography, and about a dozen other use cases that we're able to make open source contributions. So with regards to redundant capabilities and resource allocation, this is a really good example of the fact that with insider threat controls, a lot of the work that we're doing on the research side of the house is kind of shining a light between the different features and functionality that are either similar to or duplicative of one another across these different tool categories. How do you make good data-driven technology selection decisions and not end up buying the same capability twice?
Thanks, Dan. I think that's a really important point that, and to Carrie's point about resource allocation. As I understand the description of the partnership with Scilab and the Microsoft research, we're suggesting that you get maximum mileage out of the things you already own. So not only is there a convergence here of capabilities, right, putting the insider threat in the insider risk context, but rather also leveraging the same sensing mechanisms, capabilities you have, specifically to cast a wider net, for maybe lack of a better term, to also identify this specific source of risk. So I really like that concept. And also, I'm looking for your thoughts here, Carrie and Dan, about Organizations that maybe have a nascent insider threat program or are just now contemplating looking for the insider threat and managing insider risk in a more comprehensive way. So I think one important takeaway from the prior slide was that you likely have tools now you can deploy, so you're likely not starting with a blank sheet of paper. So for Carrie and Dion, if you could maybe pull that thread a little bit regarding how an organization should think about standing up an insider risk program and sort of what 0 to 1 looks like in that evolution.
Sure. Carrie is going to take this from the perspective of, here's what we say you should be doing and thinking about. I'm going to take this from the perspective of, here's what folks that we asked that same question to, who are out there trying to develop a nascent capability and mature it, here's what they told us. For the last year, we were able to conduct a survey of insider threat program practitioners. And Matt asked them the same questions that you just asked. How do you take a program from pre-scoped to something that is a full operational capability? And along the way, what challenges did you face? What best practices have you observed? And what advice would you give to somebody who's just about to start in on the development and execution of a formalized insider risk management capability within their own organizations? So we've got 2 versions of kind of the results of that survey that we were able to conduct that are publicly available. The links are being shown on the slide that we're looking at right now. The first of those is kind of an executive summary that kind of brings some of the most prominent issues to that the group that was surveyed brought forward, which were things like just making sure you've got the right level of executive buy-in and support that's needed. Because this is a cross-discipline capability and we're working across lots of different parts of the org chart, right? Having that tone at the top that says that this is a priority and these people need to come together and work for in these types of ways is necessary for the success, particularly early on with a nascent insider threat capability. A lot of the other things you'll see here with regards to challenges faced from the practitioners we studied talked about just securing the funding, and a lot of those challenges can be mitigated by helping the senior leadership better understand what exactly that they're investing in. And this is again one of the reasons why driving towards risk management is helpful, because we've got tooling in place that will already describe this to executives in the dollars and cents that they're used to making decisions with as input. So a lot of the things that you'll find kind of within our research were echoed in the survey of insider threat program practitioners that we were able to present. So the executive summary is available. There's also about a 65-page version of that goes into kind of gory detail with regards to different ways to slice and dice the survey data. It was an extensive survey. So this was a couple of dozen questions to insider threat program practitioners who have been there for quite some time across a variety of different industry sectors, so we can gain that perspective as well. Carrie, I wanted to turn it over to you to talk about kind of where our best practices for insider risk management program building can be found, particularly in an update to one of our favorite publications here within the SCI.
Sure. Yeah. So as you know, as on the slide now, the Common Sense Guide to Managing Insider Risk is soon to be released. We're on our 7th edition of our best practices and our latest research insights. And this really distills 20 years of research and practitioner experience, us experimenting, engagements such as the Microsoft collaboration, us using our empirical knowledge that we're deriving from collecting a case corpus of over 3,000 insider threat incidents, and our ability to, leverage our open source community where we have a group of over 600 practitioners out there worldwide that are insider threat experts, and allowing us to kind of engage them and utilizing instruments such as the survey through SciLab to draw upon their lessons learned and their insights. So we've been able to take the 20 years, really kind of think hard and deep, and we've put together these best practices, which we continue to build upon. So this year we're releasing our 22nd best practice, which is helping organizations think about building their own insider incident repository, so they can take those lessons learned from reflecting back on the events that they've experienced themselves, and thinking about, what are gaps and perhaps in that particular incident, and how could they have responded better, and being able to take that knowledge to retune and reconfigure the control sets that they have at their own operation. One other note in how we recommend organizations stand up nascent capabilities, as just they're beginning down the road of building an insider risk management program, is taking that use case based approach. So thinking about what are those priority key threat scenarios that top of mind for decision makers. Thinking about what are those technologies that are already in place, such as Microsoft software solution, and how they can fulfill taking advantage of those dual purpose technologies that they already have, and thinking about the data monitoring, threat detection capabilities that can be configured in those for inside threat purposes. And that kind of sets organizations up, as they're building and maturing their own internal resources, building human capital. Then they can think about, perhaps acquiring a new specialized custom solution or building their own solution to take, finer grained advantage of analytics or further data sources that they could pull into the program.
Thanks, Carrie. And I know that the Common Sense Guide to Managing Insider Risk, or previously known as insider threat, this is one of the most important set of guideposts in this domain. And it's great that we're bringing out a new edition very soon, as it says on the slide, that it's going to be on the SEI website. A question about how this guide and the practices it contains fit with the other CERT artifacts and methods. So I was hoping that maybe we could explain to the audience how the practices, the suggestions, the guidance in this publication fit with other artifacts of the Institute, like Octave Forte for risk management, or the CERT resilience management model, looking at operational resilience. So over to Carrie and Dan for maybe thoughts you have on that subject.
Yeah, so lots of hooks to other SEI artifacts in this, and I'll start with the first best practice: know and protect your critical assets. So where can we go for a capability that will allow us to identify our operationally critical assets and the threats and vulnerabilities to those, but the CERT Octave model, right? So in that best practice, we talk about how to apply Octave Allegro to the problem of identifying insider threats to critical assets. For every best practice that's listed in the guide, we also try to align that to the standards and the best practices, not only for our work, but for things like NIST standards, National Insider Threat Task Force standards, privacy frameworks, and the CERT resilience management model is kind of prominently featured as one of those artifacts that contains these specific practices that you should be doing kind of with as a more detailed look at the best practice, the level of best practice treatment we provide within the guide.
Thanks, Dan. So just to be clear for the audience, we're not suggesting that the Common Sense Guide only applies if you're using those artifacts, but rather it's one of the options. So if you are an organization where the ISO standards are front of mind for you, or you're a federal agency, and the NIST Special Publication Series is your guiding touchstones, this all fits together, correct, Dan and Carrie?
It does, yeah. And Matt, one of the ways that we'll demonstrate this is by using Octave Forte to facilitate how to think about ransomware as a threat that an insider risk management program will address. That'll be the presentation that we'll see tomorrow from Brett Tucker and Randy Trezak. So we're going to bring some very specific examples of how some of these products fit together in the conversation that Brett and Randy will lead tomorrow.
Great, thank you. So a follow-on question for Carrie and Dan. We reference here the Insider Incident Repository. Just wondering if you have any thoughts about trends, patterns, anything of interest or of note that we're seeing in the data as that compendium repository grows?
Still a strong trend, in fraud instances. Fraud makes up the majority of the cases in our data set. But we're also seeing, still a strong IP theft or intellectual property theft, sabotage, and we also recently classified misuse as a separate insider threat scenario type. And so misuse is kind of playing off of kind of like taking, misapplying and literally misusing or abusing authorized access. that didn't really fit any of the other situations and scenarios. So really kind of seeing similar patterns. We are seeing more incidents, in the past couple years, but similar, those archetypes that we originally founded, ring true to today, which, I think is a good sign that those threat models that we developed a long time ago are still taking shape and are still the cornerstone threat models in the data set.
We're also seeing an uptick in the percentage of insider incidents that are perpetrated by trusted external entities. So trusted business partners, other contractors, anyone who isn't a direct full-time employee of the organization. And Matt, what that tells me is supply chain risk management concerns kind of also bleed into insider threat program operations. We compound that problem for insider threat program operations because the type of information that we're asking for our business partners to provide back to us is very different than the type of data we'd be dealing about when we're trying to just gain a measure of cybersecurity posture and cyber hygiene, right? So a lot of the challenges with regards to kind of how do you set the bar with regards to security posture for your supply chain are made much more complicated by the types of data or the types of controls that need to be in place to have you as an organization able to assess the risk that a non-direct employee of your organization poses to your critical assets if they've got the same level of access to your organization. So you end up with the same levels of access, being able to have a lot of information that'll give you the opportunity to identify proactive approaches to managing the risk for your full-time employees and a markedly smaller collection of information allowing you to make the same types of decisions for your contractors. And that is still something that we're working through and something that you'll see kind of us tackle from a research perspective over the next year or so as well.
Yeah, thanks. I think it's an increasingly important topic for everyone, right? As their dependence on third parties continues to grow, be it cloud service providers or outsourced or offshored or anything external to the organization, done at arm's length, those entities become an extension of your organization and part of your risk ecosystem. So a thought occurred to me. I was reflecting on Greg's comments about the confounded user. So these, as you described them, Dan, these indirect employees, these third parties that you grant privileged access to. It's not simply just the scenario where you're expecting to steal IP or engage in fraud, but we will have the phenomenon of the confounded user. I'm wondering if, and maybe this is something that will appear in a future publication, but I'm wondering about the confounded user, the confused, well-intentioned third-party scenario. Have we seen any incidents like that where someone that's well-intentioned but maybe not understanding the situation does something detrimental that we would categorize as an insider threat or insider risk situation?
I would say we have quite a few general unintentional insider threat incidents in the data set. So that's an instance where, perhaps they're confounded, perhaps, they don't fully understand how to perform some type of activity to maintain security compliance. I would also say, though, this is related to perhaps the usability of the security controls that you have at hand. So if, some of these security controls are actually making it more challenging for users to perform their daily functions, that could be constraining and that could be causing those users to be inadvertent insiders. And they're not intentionally trying to exfiltrate or put something on a thumb drive. It's just that's how they feel obligated to perform their daily activities in order to efficiently, do whatever activity they needed to do. So I also think, we need to measure the usability of our security controls with this problem when we're thinking about confounded or unintentional insider incidents. The other thing that this comes to mind is, like nonfeasance, misfeasance, malfeasance, like, what is our standard? And how can we support defining, what level of, obligation do these workforce members have to fulfill their duties? So I think this kind of gets back at, when, policies are being defined, how much information is provided to the workforce member, and what are their requirements and expectations to fulfill that obligation. And maybe that goes back to, again, whether it's the human-centered design element or just the usability of our security controls and policies. But I think this is a significant issue and something also to bear in mind with these third-party relationships organizations have externally.
Yeah, so trust and a mutual understanding of responsibilities, it seems to be, right, is sort of the central themes of this discussion.
Well, so you work it backwards, right? You break up these threat actors into these different categories or classes, right? Based on the different patterns and how they operate, what motivates them, what they go after, or to be frank, what you want to do with them, right? Within your organization, how you handle a negligent insider is very different from somebody who just made a mistake because they were overworked or stressed or not paying attention, right? So you work it backwards from the, what do I want to do if I find an example of this type of threat actor that's potentially causing us harm to the organization, right? We have these kind of existential crises within insider threat program operations sometime where it's like, how much of the productivity police do we want to play within our organizations, right? There's no right answer we can apply more broadly, right? Those conversations have to be being done not only within the insider threat programs themselves, but at the highest levels of their governments within the organization. And those need to be informed by policies. Those need to be informed by what's legal to do. And to Carrie's points earlier, they need to go back to kind of setting these expectations with regards to, what is the nature of the relationship between kind of employer and employee, and understanding that it's not always the same, but from part of the world to part of the world, or position to position, or even as a point in time. So yeah, these are the kinds of things that organizations have to work through when they're trying to answer questions like that.
Excellent. So one of the chief amplifiers of all this good work has been training. So I was wondering, Carrie, if you might be able to speak to the training options that CERT is currently providing in this space, and then as a related question, the diagnostics that we develop and offer in the form of assessment. So hoping you could give the audience just an update on where we stand with our training offerings, and then maybe you could also touch on our assessments. I think they'd be appreciated by all watching.
Absolutely. So we have 4 primary training materials that we offer. First is the Insider Threat Program Manager's course, Implementation Operations. We teach that course typically monthly, and we do generally fill it. We capped the course at 25 to 30 students. And for the past year, I want to say we filled nearly every single class. This is the first course that we rolled into live online when the pandemic started, and it's been wildly successful. I always feel like I'm hearing requests to add a new ITPM course to our schedule. So that's super exciting. Next in line is the Insider Threat Analyst course, or the ITA course. And so this course is more tailored to our actual analysts, like hands-on keyboard, pulling together data sources, and perhaps using a user activity monitoring solution. So a bit more hands-on, helping them understand how to actually build some indicators or detectors, and kind of think about the response side of following up an inquiry or investigation to a potential incident. So we typically teach this course once a quarter. Also really successful. We transitioned this to live online earlier this year with the pandemic, and things have been really great thus far. So looking forward to teaching that one again. And the last 2 here, these courses actually cover our 2 diagnostic instruments that you're referring to, the Insider Threat Vulnerability Assessor, or the ITVA course, and the Insider Threat Program Evaluator, the ITPE course. Both of these courses speak to the formulation of our methodology for diagnosing, or getting diagnostics or metrics of potential vulnerabilities and organizations exposed to with their insider threat and risk management capabilities and the gaps therein. And then on the program evaluation side, it's thinking more holistically about operations and strategy of how organizations utilizing different resources, and has the formalization of our insider risk management program. So we teach those courses generally twice a year. We actually right now are in the middle of updating our instrument methodology. So when we teach these again come next spring, there should be updated material, which is really exciting. And the reason why there's updated material is because we've had a plethora of assessments recently. So we've done quite a few ITPEs and a handful of ITVAs as well. working with our industry partners, working with different organizations across the federal government, conducting these assessments and evaluations, and also collecting some lessons learned about our own methodology. What are some areas we could enhance? So that's been a really great activity. And so you'll see some updates to that coming shortly. And then the final bullet point we have here is the Insider Risk Management Program Evaluation, or the IRMPE. And so this is part of a collaboration effort with DHS CISA. In this particular assessment, we're kind of referring to as a facilitated, a self-assessment. So it's kind of a lightweight version of the Insider Threat Program Evaluation, but it's also not just a capability assessment, it's a maturity assessment. So Matt, this may interest you. This is building upon MIL scales from the past. So we have those measurement indicator levels 1 through 5. And so it's helping organizations not only identify capability gaps, but also evaluate the overall maturity in the development and formalization of their insider risk management program.
Thanks, Carrie. So quite a bit to unpack there, right? So there's a number of courses that build on one another. Our assessments continue to grow in both their type and scale and the delivery of the assessments, or the model or mode of delivery. We're closing on the end of our session. I wanted to ask both Dan and Carrie, what's next? What do we see on the horizon in insider risk here at CERT?
Yeah, so we've got a couple of thrusts to our research and kind of technical agenda for this upcoming year. First up is to get a few of the artifacts that we worked on this year up onto the website, like the Common Sense Guide. We've got a couple of reports on how on really extending the new best practice from the Common Sense Guide to help folks understand the intricacies of insider threat data collection, the use of synthetic data, what you can and can't do with it, how to collect your own data, why you need to, how much data is enough. So excited to have that one shared publicly available. And looking forward for opportunities to transition work that we've been doing with regards to helping to continue to provide insights into kind of the options there are for insider threat detection architectures, as well as control validation and ways that we can test and evaluate insider threat controls. So that's kind of one of the main engineering thrusts. And we're actually going to talk in the next session a little bit more about some of the trends and approaches and some of the things we have coming down the hopper for that. Our overarching goals remain primarily two-pronged, and that is to produce kind of experimentally derived knowledge that shows the most effective combinations of data sources and analysis techniques that can be applied to managing different types of insider risk, as well as continued further exploration of kind of the social sciences applications for insider risk. How do we apply things like positive deterrence control mechanisms that can augment or supplement what we're doing kind of on the technical detection and prevention side of the house to just make our organizations better places to work, which have the happy byproduct of also making us more resilient to insider threats? And how do we take existing literature and existing bodies of knowledge with regards to how to make those measurements on a case-by-case and individual-by-individual basis? And how do we find ways to develop proxy measures that allow us to make those at scale and make them dynamically?
Thanks, Tim. Thanks, Carrie. So we're at the end of the session. I really appreciate the insights and the updates you provided, and I'm sure that the audience found it beneficial as well. So much appreciated. We will provide the links that were referenced here in the presentation. The program is now on a break for the next 15 minutes. So we will reconvene here in the East at noon. Thanks, everyone, and talk to you soon.
Hi, I'm Kirk Cerny, Insider Threat Specialist at FishTech. In today's threat environment, your organization needs to protect its intellectual property, trade secrets, data on customers, partners, supply chains, and the integrity of critical systems that underpin your operations and your reputation. In essence, these are your company's crown jewels. Protecting and safeguarding critical data and systems from external threats is one major task. But how do you also guard against your own employees and contractors who may trigger breaches or cause harm through malice or negligence or even unwittingly? The Sideris Insider Threat Detection and Response Service, ITDR, is the first managed service to address this kind of challenge head-on. ITDR seamlessly blends technical and human behavioral indicators within a single analytics platform, providing a unique blend of cybersecurity firepower and AI-driven behavioral analysis that enables organizations to proactively mitigate their highest priority threats. With Sideris ITDR managed service, organizations will benefit from a system that accounts for the human factor in user behavioral analytics, filters out insignificant noise and false positives, prioritizes your highest risk insiders, leverages existing cyber and IT telemetry with no new data sources needed, supports investigators with analytically defensible evidence, is implemented rapidly to enable immediate insider risk mitigation. Our Insider Threat Detection and Response Service is the first of its kind. It's a human-led, machine-driven solution designed to be the foundation of any modern insider threat mitigation program. To learn more or schedule a demo, see us at fishtech.group or sideris.com.
Welcome back to the 2021 CERT Insider Risk Management Symposium. We hope you enjoyed the first half of our sessions today. Hope you enjoyed your break, and we're looking forward to another productive session as part 2 of day 1. So just as a reminder, the content that was referenced in our first discussion this morning is available on the CERT website by going to Software Engineering Institute or sei.cmu.edu. From there, you can search for the publications that were referenced, as well as the research and other documents that are publicly available on our website. So at this point, I do want to remind you, as part of our session today, we are accepting questions through the chat feature within YouTube. We want to encourage you to submit your questions. Those questions will be directed to our panel moderator as well as our panelists. We encourage you to ask questions. If questions do arise after our sessions today, we encourage you to join again tomorrow for day 2. Ask those questions, or you can reach out to any of the folks that were participating as part of the morning or afternoon sessions as part of our day 1 sessions. So at this point, it's my pleasure to introduce our next session. Our next session is a panel focusing on emerging trends in technical approaches to insider risk quantification. I do want to reintroduce Dan Costa, who will be our panel moderator. Just got finished with the morning session, and he'll be actively participating as a moderator in our afternoon session. So Dan, over to you, and thank you to you and your panelists for participating today.
Thanks very much, Randy, and I am pleased to be joined again by Carrie Gardner, our Insider Risk Team Lead. We are thrilled to be welcomed by about 1/2 of our Insider Risk team. One of the great things about this event this year is we've been so busy and been working on so many different aspects of insider risk research that we've got an opportunity for the entire team to get some time sharing lessons learned, best practices, and a little bit about their research over the 2 days of this year's symposium. So super excited to welcome Derek Spooner, Roger Black, Austin Wisnett, and Bob Ditmore for this panel as well. Bob joins us while pulling double duty today, as also serving as an instructor for one of our Insider Threat Program Manager Implementation and Operation courses that were mentioned in the last session. So Bob, kudos to you for pulling double duty here today, and really excited to talk shop with you all.
Well, thank you for that, Dan. And you know, I'll try to get lunch later. I'll get lunch off you later. So
that's right. Bob, maybe we'll get started with you and anyone else who wants to kind of chime in on this. But a lot of what we do with our research and engineering here is help folks to navigate the insider threat tool landscape, help them make good technology selection decisions, and do that in a way that aligns with the goals and scope of their insider threat program, but also being done with an understanding of the data sources and existing capabilities that they already have within their organizations. So based on the work that we've been doing over the past couple of years, could you just give us your thoughts on where the insider threat tool or control landscape is in 2021?
Thanks for that, Dan. Yeah, it definitely is something that we do monitor. We do like to see the tools that are out there. When I first started in the insider threat program and working with this team, 5-6 years ago, we were looking at the insider threat tool landscape, and it was maybe a dozen companies that are out there, definitely in the handful region. Now, when you take a look at what is the cybersecurity and insider threat landscape capabilities out there, hundreds. It's now measured in the hundreds of tools that are out there. And as you bring on like newer technologies, 5 years ago, we knew that the cloud computing was out there, but now it's ubiquitous. Everybody's doing cloud computing. Organizations are starting to embrace, the cloud and understanding how that fits into their operational tempo. But what comes along with that is the challenges that are out there. So you have those kind of traditional tools that were like data loss prevention that were out there. Well, you now need those also when you're moving data around on the cloud. So you start to see new technologies like CASB, cloud access security brokers that are out there. How do they kind of work in conjunction? There's talk of data loss prevention for the clouds as you move the data from the cloud back into your local facilities, and you kind of get that hybrid mix of the cloud versus your local compute facilities. And if you have an insider, what are the controls in place? What are the telemetry that you can monitor to look for like any kind of anomalous behavior, abnormal behavior, what would be considered normal tempo, working with those kind of capabilities that are out there, and what additional tools that you have out there. One of the tools that I would say that over the past 5 years has gained a lot of momentum is what we call identity and access management, or privileged access management. And those tools kind of give you that kind of capability of saying, well, there's stuff going on my network. It's no longer just a root with somebody using that password, but rather this person signed in to get elevated privilege to do that thing. And you can now audit a lot more capability with what's out there and some of these tools that are out there. So, definitely the landscape's changing, but the tools and capabilities that are out there are also changing. But I mean, before we get too far on that, Dan, I'll always go back. There's no one tool that's going to be your absolute insider threat be all and end all, right? It is that overall practices, policies, that team that's behind there doing the analytics. That's your insider threat program. And you need a combination of all those with those tools, using those tools effectively to reduce that probability of having an insider incident that's going to actually break out and actually hurt the organization.
Well put, Bob. Particularly that parting thought there regarding, if you're hoping to walk onto your favorite e-retailer's website and buy the solution to this, you're probably approaching this the wrong way. And as Carrie had mentioned in the morning session, the way that we've seen lots of organizations, really make positive progress in this area is by adopting kind of a use case based approach to characterizing the threat activity that you're interested in doing something about, and using that as input into the controls selection and validation processes that you put in place. And Derek, this is something near and dear to your heart, I know, and a testing and evaluation of insider threat controls. So you talked to us a little bit about the work that we've been doing in that space over the past couple of years, and some of the technology we've produced that can allow other organizations to do some of the things that we do as well.
Sure. So starting off with that use case based approach, right? You have to have that driving your requirements, driving what it is that you want to buy or build or procure, drive what you need to have in any sort of test and evaluation capability, specifically the data points that you need, the type of activity that you need to produce, synthesize, etc. So the last few years, we've had an environment that we use that we kind of build in all of these components. We've got systems that sort of mimic what you would find on an enterprise network. We've got user simulation using some other open source tools from CERT, Ghosts, and TopGen, and Graybox. We've started building on the automation of building out the infrastructure, because it doesn't do much good to have a single use infrastructure where you kind of can't customize it, or you can't press, play, pause, and rewind, so to speak, on what you're doing in that environment. So you've got to have a way to either pause or snapshot or rebuild the environment completely from scratch based on whatever new parameters you've got, based on whatever new controls you want to implement. So we've taken a leaps and bounds towards moving towards an infrastructure as code type of approach, in conjunction with our recent migration, our recent exploration of cloud solutions. Those things go kind of part and parcel with one another, infrastructure as code and cloud deployment, right? So moving towards the ability to have a rapidly deployable environment that meets the requirements that your organization needs to synthesize data or to test and evaluate tools to navigate that landscape, to navigate those hundreds, if not thousands, of potential solutions or permutations of solutions that you may have to address insider risk at your organization.
Yeah, thanks for that, Derek. I think we've seen folks starting to progress away from the we'll test it in production mindset and starting to adopt a better understanding of kind of why not to do that, particularly when it comes to insider threat detective controls, but also start to invest more heavily in the concept of working, testing, and evaluation as a continuous activity that is a core part of their insider threat program operations. Roger, as someone who helps us with the development of kind of the infrastructure as code that's necessary to deploy some of these environments. Could you just walk us through kind of what some of those tools of the trade are and some of the best practices that you've observed kind of helping to develop these capabilities that can allow organizations to stand up really rapidly, test and evaluation environments that mimic their operational settings?
Yeah, we use most of the standard infrastructure as code tools, something like Terraform, Ansible. These are tools that are familiar to most of your IT staff. And so again, it allows us to quickly spin up environments. It allows us to fail fast. We can inject any number of permutations, modifications, and test them out and see what kind of functionality we can get.
This is good news that we're able to reuse a lot of the same kind of components that other parts of our organizations are likely already familiar with, right? So this shouldn't be a barrier to entry for insider threat program operations. Go talk to the people that are already maintaining, those types of capabilities and help them gain an understanding of what kind of infrastructure you need. And Derek, Carrie, Bob, whoever wants to take this, determining those needs is something we've spent a lot of time talking about. And a lot of that comes down to kind of how realistic the test environment needs to be. Anybody want to take a whack at guidance or best practices or recommendations we have on how you find the degrees of realism for your test and evaluation environment that are necessary?
So I'll go ahead and get the conversation started with some of the requirements that you may have for what you would observe in an enterprise organization, right? So we have the two parts of insider risk, technical and behavioral. So the ability to both generate and collect data for finding those technical observables, for finding those behavioral observables. So what log sources do you need to portray a realistic synthesis of what you might actually observe in a production network in your development, in your test environment. So again, that use case based approach, identify what you're trying to find. You can sort of back that up from that point and say, what data sources do I need to address that use case or to detect that activity in my organization? The combination of, again, both technical and behavioral. So building that whole picture, building the ability for your program to detect those folks that are moving towards doing something in their behavioral aspects, as well as their technical attributes.
I'll take that question kind of from the human-centered design approach when we're thinking about requirements gathering. A lot of us are starting to apply some design research methods and, conducting stakeholder interviews, doing documentation review, really getting an understanding of what is the current state of a particular organization's environment, what's their current digital stack, if you will, where do they want to go, perhaps with cloud and different microservices that they can integrate into their solution stack. And so when we're conducting these initial interviews and kind of gaining awareness of what their operating environment is, that kind of feeds into us translating where they're at with where they want to go and building out requirements for emulating their environment and creating that test and evaluation platform. So I think there's a lot, for folks to learn from just general human-centered design research and design research methods in order to, get an understanding of how to build out that test and evaluation platform.
Yeah, thanks for that, Carrie. Bob, anything to add?
Yeah, the one thing I'd like to point out is that part of when we're doing these model and simulation environments, one of the things that drives, one of the key aspects that we're trying to get from that is we need an environment where we can get to ground truth. At the end of the day, if we're trying to do this on a live network, if you're doing it on a live network, you don't know whether you have an insider active or not, right? So what we have to do is we have to set up an environment to give us that ground truth. Whatever is occurring, and again, we use this technique where we use non-player characters. We borrow that from the gaming industry, where we have automatons, robots, actually hitting the buttons, right? The other aspect, so again, one part of it is having ground truth. The other part of it, what we need to do is understand the level of reality that we're trying to do. Now, I could come up with a simulation kind of like, a video game where I simulate the entire world. And from that standpoint, I would generate the logs out of the code that I wrote. But really, that's not a very it's not a very realistic simulation of what we're trying to model. Right. What we want to do is we want those non-player characters, those robots, actually simulating like they are users pounding on a keyboard. The nice thing about that is it generates real network traffic. It generates real log traffic on that operating system they're using. It actually then starts to tickle events through the rest, propagating through the rest of the systems that we're looking at, so that we can maybe find controls out there that we hadn't thought about before, because we're now getting parts of a real, a simulation that's more realistic to a real world event occurring, that, okay, we can now expand our research and say, oh yes, if we did look at this particular part of it, or we looked at this part of the network, maybe we could infer something that that behavior might indicate an anomalous behavior. So again, we have that ground truth with normal behaviors, and then when we do inject an insider threat, we can then see what perturbations it sends through the rest of the network to determine whether there's some additional research that we could do there and efficacy of that type of indicator.
And to add to Bob's point, you have that real user activity. We've built the environment where we have real infrastructure activity. These aren't just users typing away. They're authenticating against AD. They're authenticating it against Exchange. There's real DNS queries because we have real DNS, real AD, and real file servers stood up. So you get a very realistic, holistic picture of activity on your network.
Yeah, I mean, that's important, Roger, for a couple of different reasons, right? Within a test and evaluation capability like this, a lot of what we're doing is experimenting. We're trying to find the most effective ways to make some of these measurements and quantify different characteristics of a risk model that we've developed. Or we're trying to figure out, is this risk model going to work in the hands of analysts, right? So it can't be, so the degree of realism we need within an environment to support that type of work really does go all the way down to make this look as close to our operational networks and environments as possible, and make it responsive to changing based on the ways that users are kind of interacting with the infrastructure that's in there, real or fake ones. Bob, we talked a good deal about modeling. Austin, I wanted to get your thoughts on the simulation part of this. Can you talk to us a little bit about how simulation can help insider risk quantification or just insider threat program operations more broadly?
Yeah, absolutely. And I'm listening to the conversation so far. I think that one of the major benefits, as you're kind of getting at here, is bringing all of that data in, the simulated data, so that we can have some probabilities to load into more of a more programmatic simulator. The programmatic simulators are a little bit more accessible for organizations that maybe don't have a fully developed insider threat team, or just getting started, or particularly useful for organizations that maybe don't know what their use cases are yet. So being able to pull together a code that involves the simulated data on the technical side, policies, and then also the threat models that I know we're going to get into a little bit more, and analyze those through different types of, like a Monte Carlo simulation, where you can run thousands or even tens of thousands of runs very quickly, is something that we're hoping to get to as well, so that organizations can have maybe a tool that's a little bit easier than a fully developed testing environment for them.
Excellent, thanks for that. I wanted to circle back to something Bob brought up in some of his opening remarks, which was anomaly detection. Carrie, can you talk to us about what we've learned or what we've seen working with other insider threat program practitioners over the past couple of years with regards to how anomaly detection fits in with insider risk quantification, and also just what's been working or not working with regards to anomaly detection for insider threat program operations?
Absolutely. So anomaly detection is just another tool in the analytic tool shed. Here's different capabilities where we can potentially detect suspicious or perhaps malicious activity. So the known approach where we actually have a pattern, we have perhaps a chronology of events that need to take place in order to detect a particular malicious known bad thing. That's more of a classification approach. We're looking for that pattern. Whereas on the anomaly side of analytic detection, we're looking for things that are just different, that don't fit that pattern, but don't really fit the baseline of normal operations. So anomaly detection could be helpful when we're not quite sure. There's perhaps those unknowns, and we want to make sure we can, verify that activity is a trusted activity, it's compliant activity, and it's not malicious. So it's something that can be used to augment known patterns of malicious activity, just to provide a further view for an insider threat analyst to kind of think about, this is something we should consider and perhaps we should look into. Anomaly detection, though, has also been used to detect insider threat incidents when we're thinking about excessive use of printers, excessive use of file transfers, downloading excessive number of files locally to your desktop. And that's something where perhaps at the time there wasn't a pattern-based detection analytic to look at the activity, and so anomaly-based detection was able to define and identify that. So I find that anomaly detection to be a good supplement, but something also that the analyst should be cognizant is not a known pattern of malicious activity. And so when an analyst does view something that was found by an anomaly detection algorithm, there should always just be situational awareness of, how should the follow-up proceed, and how can the analyst build context of the surrounding events related to that anomalous event. Just to ensure that, just because something was unusual, it's not by definition suspicious. And so I think there needs to be that fine but bright line between anomalous and bad activity.
Yeah, thanks for that, Carrie. I think we saw a good reminder of where this fits into the overarching set of capabilities for inside of their programs. About a year and a half ago at this point, when everyone's normal changed and everyone's baseline of application access, of volume of access, of patterns of working hours changed, right? And we saw where lots of organizations going to struggle with how to quickly adjust or recontextualize how they use anomaly detection in the context of inside of their program operations. And we're about to see that, hopefully, soon, when everyone's normal changes again, and we start to see folks head back into the office in larger capacity. So what can organizations do to learn from the lessons we learned in March of last year to better prepare themselves for another change in normal?
I would say, it goes back to the purpose of the analytic, and so really defining use cases for how this analytic solution can give intelligence to the analysts using it. And I think this is where we have a lot to learn from the human-centered design aspect of software solution development. Providing the right information to the analyst and kind of like making sense of this intelligence is critical. The outcomes of, these inquiries can be life-changing. And because of the sensitivity and the criticality of that, I think we do need to be very cautious, particularly when we're talking about anomalies, which are not definitely known malicious activities. And so as we're moving forward into return to office planning and potentially, continue the use of anomaly detection for particular use cases, really just taking care and making sure that things that are identified through anomaly detection are fully vetted, or, we've tuned and we've kind of back tested even the ability of anomaly detection to give us good intelligence, and how can we triple check and verify that information when proceeding with making a decision.
Good points, Carrie. Bob, I think a lot of what Carrie was just recommending also applies to just the broader use of artificial intelligence and machine learning as kind of components of our insider threat technical detection capabilities. This is something that you've been working on for a lot of our different customers over the past couple of years. So you just talk to us about some of the work that we've done with regards to contextualizing the use of AI and ML for insider risk quantification, and what we've learned and what we can share with the audience about some of that.
Sure, Dan. One of the things that I think the key phrase here is to be cautious when using these sort of things. When you bring on artificial intelligence and the machine learning capability, one of the things that you need to be aware of, and if you follow any of the literature there could be a lot of biases in the actual algorithms. Sometimes you can't actually explain why the particular AI ML algorithm came up with the answer that it did. And if you don't have that kind of explainability there, you could potentially open yourself up to some problems for your insider threat program. So again, as Carrie was saying, you have to make sure that you're vetting this answers quite a bit. So you make sure that you understand where that answer came from and whether there's enough plausibility there, and you can have corroborating evidence based on that. So I would say that, again, caution is the watchword for a lot of organizations to understand that. One of the patterns that I've been seeing that I think is successful trying to incorporate AI ML, if they're going to use that, is maybe look at it as a historical perspective instead of a predictive perspective. So basically, if something does occur, run their AI ML algorithms over the data that you have, see if they would have caught that same information that you may have caught through other mechanisms as part of your insider threat program. And once you then have enough confidence that your AI ML is not going to actually, blame somebody or accuse somebody that shouldn't be accused, and you have to then make sure that that's being done. Once you have some confidence in it, then you can start turning it on, looking for some predictive capabilities out of it to see if it can actually, you can be using that as part of your overall another tool in your actually insider threat program. So again, the caution there is to make sure that you tread very slowly. Again, the other thing that we see when we're working with different programs is that there's just not enough legal precedents out there to say that if they did use that, whether it would actually stand up. So again, as they use that, they're being very cautious, as they should be, using any new technology, especially a technology that's as powerful and as game-changing as artificial intelligence and machine learning actually brings to the table.
Yeah, and something to add here, going back to our tool testing engagements, is we would evaluate these tools that would suggest that a particular user has an insider risk score of 89, or just like some particular quantitative number. And I would always follow up and ask, how did you derive that? But also, what should the analyst do with that number? Is this 89 risk score relative to something, or is this supposedly an absolute score? And if so, what's next? And I think that's just generally lacking in a lot of the ML AI risk scoring applications specifically. And I think that's where there's a major gap in need for insider risk management programs to provide very specific tailored guidance for analysts to make sense of this data that they're receiving from ultimately these decision support tools, and helping them translate and understand what's next and how should I follow up with this information. I know some of our colleagues in the AI division have referred to something like a nutrition label almost of, here's like how to make sense of this, and here's like the warning label almost attached. And I think, we're starting to see, and I've definitely heard myself, questions from our stakeholders and like, what are those limitations, but also what, should we do and just be cautious of. So the pushback is definitely gaining momentum, and it's something I'm hoping we're able to partner with the AI division folks more closely on, and just gain more situational awareness of here on our team, because I think that's definitely the future, and making sure we can trust and verify and validate the output coming out of these ML and AI solutions.
And those are excellent points, but I think underlying this and the attractiveness of having an AI ML solution out there is that you can do more with less. So, again, as an emerging trend that's also been a past trend unfortunately for a lot of insider threat programs, is a downward pressure on funding for the organization. So the ability to have that augmented decision capability, that ability to have a AI ML algorithm running over those massive amounts of data that's coming in. And again, that's a trend going forward, is more higher volume, more velocity of that data coming in. If you could actually apply AI ML algorithm 24/7 and provides you capabilities that augment the team that you have. Again, you don't have to grow the team, but you can do more with the team that you have. So you can actually do more with less. And that's a lot of, that's a trend that's been in the past and is definitely going forward, is trying to get as much done with as few resources as you can. And that's why, AI ML does seem to provide that attractive panacea that maybe it's the solution going forward, but it does come with a lot of cautionary tales that if you're going to use it.
Yeah, great discussion all. I think there's consensus not only on this panel, but across a lot of the folks that we work with regarding we're not likely going to take the humans completely out of the loop here when we're trying to make decisions about what to do regarding insider risk and potentially active insider threats. The question becomes, how much of that work that needs to be done to get to the point where we're making a decision do we trust technology to do without a human in the loop, right? And I think a lot of the testing and evaluation we've done with the insider threat controls on this team over the past several years have helped to start make that line brighter. Derek, can you talk about just some of the metrics that we use when we're kind of evaluating the efficacy of some of these insider threat controls? What are we looking for, and what should other organizations be trying to generate by way of metrics when they're trying to evaluate some of these capabilities?
Sure. So first and foremost, again, back to that coverage of your indicators. What percentage of things that you're looking for, again, technical, behavioral, mix and match, can you find with a given tool? What percentage of systems, what percentage of users on your network can you cover, given the amount of funding you've got? Do you have to, we've seen organizations that in order to minimize costs will, until it gets to a certain point, they won't turn on the greater amount of logging for a particular individual, or they won't add them to the watch list, so to speak, that produces more logging, produces more of a footprint on the systems too, if they're deploying some additional agent for users that surpass some threshold. So where do you draw the line organizationally in terms of your actual tool coverage? How are you responding to or reacting to what your analysts are seeing from day to day? Is a new control adding some exponential or logarithmic increase of alerts per day that are just bogging down your analysts that they couldn't possibly get through in a reasonable 9 to 5 or what have you shift? So keeping track of that type of metric is also very important operationally speaking.
Yeah, all really good stuff, Derek. And I think the kinds of things inside of their program practitioners need to work into how they go about evaluating some of these solutions. I want to encourage the audience following along live on YouTube to send questions to our panelists. Happy to tee those up and ask and answer. And while we wait on some of those, Carrie, maybe you can get us started with just a state of the practice with regards to insider threat modeling and what we're seeing work well for organizations that are trying to advance their capabilities in the areas of using threat modeling as an effective part of their insider risk management capabilities.
Absolutely. I'll take the first part of this, and then I'd like to pitch it over to Austin to help kind of expand upon it. So, when we see and we think about threat modeling, we're thinking about that pattern-based approach. So usually it starts at the top, perhaps with IT sabotage, intellectual property theft, fraud. And then once they have defined those use cases, organizations typically then define particular indicators that flow from the chronology events associated with those use cases. And so insider threat programs can configure and tune their analytics and their models to identify and look for those particular indicators, as they're monitoring different events that are aggregated together in whatever solution stack that they have. So that's kind of like the detection-based approach, where there's in some ways kind of a manual process of breaking down and decomposing each of your threat models, and then defining particular detectors or indicators, leveraging multiple data sources, whether it's IAM or PAM, as Bob was mentioning earlier, and identity access management and privilege access management, data loss prevention solutions, network traffic tools, really kind of having a full suite and holistic view. But also, these detectors can take in other information that perhaps has been processed. And I'm thinking of perhaps some communication data that did get clearance through HR and legal to get analyzed. And perhaps, that can be used as a filter mechanism to identify particular keywords, particular topics of interest, sentiment. And that information, then that's an example of kind of having a machine learning augmenting part of the pipeline to build out an indicator within a threat model pattern that is being looked for and modeled. So that's an example of kind of applying that pattern-based approach, taking those top-level use cases, decomposing them down to indicators, and then utilizing different analytic tools to look for and identify different indicators. Austin, perhaps you want to talk a little bit more about Monte Carlo modeling and some other aspects of simulation and modeling?
Sure. Yeah, I think that was a great explanation of the different types of modeling options that we have. For organizations that might be having trouble kind of getting started with that, another option is to look at something like the CERT Guide to Insider Threat and just pick an example or two out of that and see what your organization could do with that particular example. Once you get your feet underneath you with that, maybe tweak some of the indicators in those. So for example, if the original situation was data exfiltration, maybe you change it to data sabotage and think about how that would affect your organization. So starting to tweak those different indicators, those different processes in there to look at how your organization would be effective. And that kind of takes us back into that simulation piece. So as you're tweaking those different indicators by hand, you start coming up with all different kinds of examples. And at some point, you have a lot more than maybe you can do in terms of like a tabletop exercise or a thought exercise. And then you start looking into some of those simulation tools or test environments and things like that.
Yeah, really good stuff. Austin, I want to pull at a little bit of connective tissue here between the tools that we have as technical detection capabilities for how well our organization is adhering to the policies that we've got that govern how authorized access or critical access should look and how it definitely shouldn't look, and how those policies are developed and kind of administered and maintained kind of at the enterprise levels within the organization. Are we doing a good job keeping those two things in sync? If not, why not? And what can we be doing, or what should organizations be doing to try to make that easier?
This is always a fun question for different organizations. It's really hard to manage all these policies, as I'm sure most people that are listening know. I think the biggest point here, and Bob touched on this at the very beginning, is to have your goal in mind. What is it specifically that you're trying to do? For most of us, maybe it's reduce insider threats. It could even have a monetary value on it, reduce insider threat by X amount, that sort of thing. So start with knowing what your goal is. And then when you're looking at evaluating different policies or even different tools, look at the metrics that are available to you and kind of do essentially a cost-benefit analysis at a high level. Cost is kind of an easy one. How much in dollar amounts is this going to cost to implement, to maintain, those sorts of things. Benefit can be a little bit harder. How do I quantify the risk? How do I quantify, how much a data sabotage incident is going to cost me and that sort of thing. So start with the goal, focus on what metrics you're going to use to compare different policies or tools. And once you know those two things, I think it becomes a lot easier to try to focus on or prioritize which policies you need to maintain.
Derek, anything to add there with regards to lessons learned that we've come across regarding helping organizations draw a tighter and shorter and straighter line between what's on paper and what their UAM tools can detect or prevent?
Sure. It again comes back to that understanding of policy. understanding how your organization is categorizing insider risk, whether it is very niche and limited to things like data loss, or broader in terms of espionage or corporate espionage, things of that nature. So having that understanding of what is a policy violation at your organization, and then using that knowledge that you've gained by talking to your IT folks, to talking to the policy writers at your organization, and then building that into your detective capability, whether it's something like user activity monitoring, data loss prevention, or other types of tools. So involving the folks that kind of need to be part of that decision, of that discussion process, to use that to drive how you're actually implementing those indicators on from day to day.
And in years past, we've seen kind of this decoupling from the policies for certain really large organizations, because it turns out there's an unwritten exception to this policy for these system administrators who actually need to do things a little bit different and not back up their systems that way because that license expired, or we can't get that person into the SCIF to actually perform that maintenance, right? So these exceptions to the policies end up being the things that insider threat analysts are chasing down when it comes time to trying to figure out why we've got such a noisy false positive rate. And I think something from a research and engineering perspective that would be ripe for additional exploration are opportunities by which we can take that feedback from the analysts, feed that back to the policy folks in some mechanism that'll give them an opportunity to tailor the policy to what the organization is seeing or experiencing, and get this out of annually we'll review it, right? But get it more driven towards on the taking input from the detection side of the house to help them better understand potential opportunities to enhance or right size a policy for a specific part of the organization.
Absolutely. So take input from your analyst is sort of the driving point there. Take frequent input from your analysts, reducing false positives, adjusting policy, making exceptions, or grouping individuals into different monitoring categories. To your point of, some folks need this ability to, let's say, burn a CD or insert a USB drive, where 95 or 98% of your organization doesn't have that ability via policy or some technical control. So using that input from your analysts to drive both the policies, the capital P policies, your organizational policies, as well as the monitoring and detection policies that you've got in your program.
Go ahead, Bob.
So Dan, I'd add to what Derek and you were saying there is that, again, when we talk about the Insider Threat Program, we're talking about it being a cross-cutting across the organization, working with other parts of the organization. And what I've seen, for some successful organizations, what they've done is they've actually got a change management program in place so that these type of exceptions are time-bound with noted auditable trails that say, yes, you are allowed to do this for this given period of time. If you need any more time, you come back to us. The Insider Threat Program would then work with that change management group, and they would be aware of it so that it's not a matter of having to run down. So this is one of the best practices that we've seen out there in industry. So making sure that your Insider Threat Program is working with those change management folks.
Really good stuff, Bob. I think it's that this is the communication channel that needs to be opened up that Derek identified. And then you brought to the party the how that looks from an insider threat governance perspective. Roger, is there an opportunity for us to kind of leverage our infrastructure as code capabilities as a way to help tie a straighter line between, the policy as it's written in the Microsoft Word file and the way that our technical detection controls are configured?
I think so. One of the benefits of infrastructure as code is having a known product put out there on your network. The configuration, and likewise, you'll know when something changes. And the key there is knowing why it changed or who accessed it. So infrastructure as code sort of goes hand in hand. The benefits from the administrator side are the same benefits from the insider analyst side, in knowing when and why something changed.
Yeah, one of the things that's been hard for us has been to have the insider threat program operations folks be able to explain how the tools are currently configured with regards to the things that they detect. So if we can't get them to explain it, and this is where infrastructure as code might be able to help, right? How do we then square that circle with regards to what the policy says they should or shouldn't be able to detect? So a lot of that used to just be expressed with like the specific and explicit way that the tools were configured. And you'd have to use screenshots from the knobs and switches that were turned on in a capability to say, well, this is what we're looking for, right? Come back a layer of abstraction. We have a conversation with a different kind of information sharing mechanism in place that says, these are the things that we're actually set up to configure. And to do it outside of the current tool stack that you have also might be a way to kind of further influence or increase the likelihood of successful collaboration between the people configuring the tools to enforce the policies and the people actually writing the policies themselves. It's good stuff, Roger. Again, a few more minutes for this panel for questions. So if you're watching along live, please don't hesitate to ask questions to our esteemed panelists with regards to kind of where we're at in the space of kind of insider risk quantification, particularly on the technical side. Carrie, wanted to pivot to you as we've got about 10 minutes left here, to start talking about kind of what's next. What's the future of insider risk quantification look like? What are the unsolved problems that we think we need to work on, and kind of where do we see some of this space heading?
Yeah, absolutely. So starting to hit on the human-centered design aspect. So I'll just say and kind of summarize the thoughts there is we have a lot of work to do to help make these analytic solutions usable, to help make those risk quantification solutions usable. On the life cycle of implementing and engineering those different quantitative measures to manage risk. Another angle I think that has a lot of room to grow is text analytics and allowing organizations to take advantage of the voluminous unstructured data that's passing over their networks day to day. And I think this is a classic example of where we need to be careful and where having those close relationships with HR and legal, to Dan's point in the YouTube chat, is paramount. But at the same time, it's something that can be achieved with the right use case and the right control set and actually deploying and implementing a text analytics capability. So for instance, text analytics can help support data loss prevention efforts and actually identifying different sensitive documents that may not be properly marked. So user may have forgotten or otherwise decided not to actually mark a document correctly. But a smart, data loss prevention solution can be able and tuned to actually automatically label and tag documents based upon a known set of what those types of documents generally look like, what generally are the types of words used and context used to describe this particular classified or sensitive topic. And the new literature, the new research emerging from text analytics and natural language processing more generally has vastly improved historical methods of operation using bag of words based approaches. And now we're really taking advantage of deep learning methods where we're taking word embedding models to build context windows around a particular word. And that's allowed researchers and engineers to gain a lot of insight into building out subsequent classification systems, regression systems, et cetera, based upon having kind of a fuller view and context of how these words and how we're kind of deriving our natural language. So I think there's a lot of different kind of like maybe micro use cases of applying text analytics to help identify indicators, help build context that can be applied. It's just kind of like partnering with HR and legal to understand, what can and can't we do with this technology, and then finding those, ways we can augment existing software solutions to help build, further understanding, kind of bring to light further intelligence for the analyst as they're reviewing, potential events and kind of, having that pane of glass in front of them and kind of just building awareness and context of what's going on with particular events.
Thanks, Carrie. Bob, wanted to get your thoughts on kind of where we're heading with regards to kind of the insider risk management tool landscape. Are we done? Do we expect to see more changes? Are tools becoming more or less similar to one another across those groups? And what advice do you have for our audience members who might be just trying to wrap their heads around what to buy or to buy anything at all?
Well, I mean, definitely you want to take advantage of, installing it and trying it before you buy it. So try before you buy, and then really work with your vendor if you're going to bring a tool in, especially if it's going to be a costly tool. With that said, the tool landscape is changing as rapidly as the threat landscape is changing. The technology landscape is changing. I mean, they're all kind of moving at a high velocity. It's hard sometimes to even keep your head wrapped around it at any given time. And given that, I mean, we talked about DLP tools. Those DLP tools are morphing, and you're starting to see things like security orchestration. You're starting to see, endpoint reduction. I mean, a lot of these tools are starting to morph, and what one tool used to do, another tool is now picking up part of that mission, and another part of the tool is actually picking up another part of the mission. So it's definitely something that you do need to pay attention to, find out, who are on the different quadrants, whether they're ascending in technology or, past the technology curve and where they're at on that sort of thing. So definitely a, rapid changing environment that, is good fodder for, web surfing and finding out what's going on and what's the best out there, and finding out and then figuring out what works best for your organization.
Thanks, Bob. Derek, where are we headed with our insider threat control testing capabilities over the next year plus?
So we're sort of continuing that notion of evaluating what tools and techniques are available commercially. Moreover, we're trying to augment those with some in-house solutions, some in-house ideas that could potentially replace or augment some of those where those commercial tools are lacking. So building upon the knowledge that we've gained through looking at these incidents over time, where can we add and where can we contribute to that tool landscape? How can we help folks navigate that tool landscape by, again, to the point that keeps coming back of try it before you buy it, have some mechanism, whether it is on-prem, cloud-based, using any of the tools that we've sort of alluded to throughout this conversation, to try it before you buy it, understand what you need and where you're going. Is it something that you could potentially build in-house? Is it something that you could potentially reference, something that someone else has done to try to build that in-house or enhance the capabilities that you've got already to address new indicators that you may be trying to develop?
And to harken back to something Bob mentioned early on, no one tool in effect is going to be able to cover everything. The one tool, the vendor provided tool, can augment what you're doing manually, or what you're doing manually can augment the vendor tool. But there's probably going to be a gap there, and you may have to look a little deeper into what you really need.
Yeah, very, very well put, Roger. I think the other complicating factor here is there's so much overlap between the capabilities within these tools now, and I don't see that trend changing in the next year or so. Right, so that puts more of an impetus or onus on insider threat program operators to break those tools down into their component parts, what actually they can do or not do, or what you need them to do or not do, as a vital component to an insider threat technology selection decision. Austin, wanted to get any parting thoughts from you by way of kind of what's next for insider risk, particularly on the mod, SIM, or policy analysis fronts.
Yeah, so I'm a big fan of policy analysis through simulation. So I'm hoping that we as an organization at CERT and more generally in the community get to do some more of that, help make those tools and those data sets more effective and more efficient for analyzing complex policies and figuring out which of those pieces of those policies is working, what's useful, what's not, so that we can feed it back into our insider threat programs.
Tremendous. Well, I'd like to thank all of our panelists for a really engaging conversation. Greatly appreciate the time, Derek, Austin, Bob, Roger, and Carrie. And Bob, again, hat tip for pulling double duty. Best of luck with the remainder of the Insider Threat Program Manager course. And with that, I'd like to turn things back to Randy Trezak for some closing remarks for the first day of our symposium.
Thanks very much, Dan. I want to echo Dan's comments and say thank you to our panelists. It was a great engaging discussion, and we do appreciate the comments as well as the questions that did come through the chat feature. So at this point, we're wrapping up our day one of our Insider Risk Management Symposium. We do appreciate your participation as part of the first half and the second half of day one, and we encourage you to check back in tomorrow. Tomorrow being the 29th of September, we'll kick our event off at 11 a.m. Eastern Daylight Time, similar to what we did today. Now, as we reflect on our sessions today, we do hope you did gain value out of our first presentation. The first presentation, which focused on what's new from the Software Engineering Institute. Just as a reminder, a number of the documents that were referenced are available on the Software Engineering Institute's website. Going to sei.cmu.edu, you'll find a wealth of information, including the Common Sense Guide that was mentioned and reviewed by Carrie earlier on in our session today, as well as over 125 other documents that are publicly available on the SEI website focused on insider risk mitigation. In addition, we do want to also call attention to some of the other resources that were mentioned earlier today. Dan and others mentioned the Open Source Insider Threat Information Sharing Working Group, or OSIT. That's a community of interest that was referenced. If you are interested in joining, that's for our private sector organizations. We're welcome to reach out to us after our session today, where we can get you more information on the OSIT, the Open Source Insider Threat Information Sharing Working Group, and hopefully you become a member of that particular group. As we look to say thank you to our moderators today, as well as our panelists, we also want to call attention and say thank you to the sponsors of our event, Code 42, SideDress, as well as ForcePoint. Thank you so much for your sponsorship to our event today, as well as into tomorrow. And as we look to our sessions for tomorrow, I just want to do a very brief preview of what you can expect in terms of presentation and panel sessions tomorrow. Tomorrow, we will open up with a presentation, The Unspoken Threat, Ransomware Infections via the Insider Threat Vector. We'll take a break, then we'll come back with a panel session, which is the balanced approaches to insider risk management. So as we look to close our event today, we do encourage you to submit the survey. We do want to get feedback on the value that you perceived or really took out of our event today, as well as we do recommend that you submit the survey, as it can help you influence future events, as well as the research direction of us here in the Software Engineering Institute as a federally funded research and development center. So with that, I do want to close our event saying that it was a very successful event today. Thank you for all the attendees. Thank you for all the participants. And we look forward to seeing you tomorrow at 11 a.m. Eastern Daylight Time. Thank you so much very much for your participation, and we look forward to seeing you tomorrow. Have a great remainder of your day.